We continue our study of the book of Hebrews. We're in Hebrews chapter 11, and we have left off as we began talking about Moses, beginning with verse 23. By faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents, because that they saw he was a proper or goodly or beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. You know full well the story of Moses, how that he was put into an ark and set loose on the Nile River, and was then picked up by Pharaoh's daughter and adopted as her own. And then Moses' mother was his nursemaid. So he got the best, as it were, of both worlds. He got spiritual instruction from his mother, but yet he was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. As Stephen puts it in Acts chapter 7, we'll discuss what that means here in a moment. But then he says in verse 24, by faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Here we have the Hebrews writer giving us inspired commentary on what is described by Moses himself in the book of Exodus. And what he describes, what Moses himself describes about the circumstances that led to him leaving Egypt, are fascinating and makes for high drama. One of my favorite movies of all time is The Ten Commandments. To me, Charlton Heston is Moses. Nobody else can play Moses like Charlton Heston. Let's just be honest. Nobody could play a lot of roles like Charlton Heston could. But Ten Commandments, I know it's over the top and it's campy in some places, but still it's one of my favorite movies. And the fact is, the story of Moses gives itself over to high drama. I did watch Exodus, Gods and Kings, and I was pleased with the special effects, with the Red Sea parting, even though really nothing can match, again, the Ten Commandments depiction of it, but still, it was great CGI. But then they just played fast and loose with the biblical text in so many places. And normally, when you see the story of Moses depicted in movies or in cartoons like The Prince of Egypt that came out in the 90s, they will depict the Pharaoh of the oppression and the Pharaoh of the Exodus as Ramses the Great. And they will also say that Moses and Ramses the Great grew up together and had a split when Moses made his choice to leave Egypt. Well, there's a problem with that. The timeline doesn't fit. It really does not fit. The Pharaoh of the oppression and the Pharaoh of the Exodus are two different pharaohs. And if you look at the timeline of the pharaohs of Egypt, you'll see that immediately. Now, my personal belief, and there are scholars aplenty that differ on who the Pharaoh of the oppression, the Pharaoh of the Exodus is. My belief is that the Exodus was early. There was an early date for the Exodus. And because of that, Ramses the Great was not the Pharaoh of the Exodus. It was another Pharaoh. And I will explain that here in a moment. Now, let me tell you a short side story. Back in 1987, you may remember the Ramses exhibit came to Memphis, Tennessee. And the centerpiece of the Ramses exhibit that was put there in the pyramid, which was a brand new auditorium, a brand new coliseum then in Memphis, was the giant statue, colossal stone statue of Ramses the Great. Now, I was a senior at Freed-Hardeman. One afternoon, a couple of friends of mine who worked for the Bell Tower, the local paper, the school paper, said, "Do you want to go to Memphis for free?" I said, "Sure." They said, "We're going to see the Ramses exhibit. It won't cost you anything. We need a third person to go with us." I said, "Yeah, I'd love to." Didn't have anything else to do. I'd gotten through with all my homework and didn't have anything that was burdening me down, so I'd agreed to go. So we all get into a hatchback, a small hatchback automobile. I was in the back seat of this hatchback with no seatbelt, terrified that I was going to die all the way from Henderson to Memphis. Well, we got there without incident, and then we got into the pyramid and got our credentials and went into the pyramid and went up the escalator, and the more you go up the escalator, the more I saw that stone statue, and I kept looking up, 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 up. It filled the whole room, it seemed. And all of the jewelry, all of the finery, all of the things that went along with the Ramses exhibit were in full display. And it really drove home to me the finery and the opulence and the splendor and the glamour of Egypt. Seeing all of that. The King Tut exhibit came through the United States in 1978, I believe, and it made quite a stir. Steve Martin famously recorded a song called King Tut along with it. But still, it was a grand spectacle to see. And when the Ramses exhibit came to Memphis, part of the advertising was, is this the Pharaoh of the Exodus? Well, that's the popular conception. But again, the problem is the timeline doesn't fit. My personal belief is that the Pharaoh of the oppression was Tutmos or Tutmoses III, and the Pharaoh of the Exodus was Amenhotep II. Now, let me give you a little bit of backstory on this. Notice in the Exodus account and here in Hebrews, it refers to Moses being taken by Pharaoh's daughter. He refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He had already been taken out of the water by Pharaoh's daughter. Who was this daughter of Pharaoh? I firmly believe it was Hatshepsut. Now, the way you pronounce her name is Hatshepsut. A hot, cheap suit. Hatshepsut, that's her name. Hatshepsut. She was one of only two female pharaohs of Egypt. Only one of two. The most successful female pharaoh of Egypt, by the way. She ruled for 22 years. Her husband was Tutmos or Tutmoses II, which, by the way, was also a blood kin to her. Yeah, there was a lot of intermarriage among the pharaohs. Pretty yicky. But still, Tutmos II and Hatshepsut were both married. Well, Tutmosis II dies under mysterious circumstances, probably poisoned. So Hatshepsut becomes co-reigning as Pharaoh with her son, actually her stepson. She didn't have a son on her own. Her stepson, Tutmosis III. For 22 years, Hatshepsut and Tutmosis III co-reign because Tutmosis III is not old enough to sit on the throne. So for 22 years this takes place. All right, all of a sudden Hatshepsut dies, again under mysterious circumstances. Well, as it turns out, Tutmosis III tries to obliterate all record of Hatshepsut from all of the statuaries, all the walls, everything, tries to eliminate her existence. He failed, though, because there is now in Europe an exhibit about Hatshepsut that still survives. And we now know where Hatshepsut is buried. Her mummy has also been examined by those far more qualified than I to do that examination. So, Hatshepsut dies, Tutmosis III comes into power. Now, if what I'm saying is right, and I think I am right, then Moses and Tutmosis III grew up together for 22 years. So, Hatshepsut has snatched this baby out of the Nile River and called him her son. Would that not create a little bit of jealousy on the part of the stepson, whom he suspects that his stepmother had his own father put to death? Would that not create some friction, perhaps, and some high drama? Well, eventually, Hatshepsut decides in the latter part of her reign that she's going to throw off all pretense. For a while, early on in her reign, she disguised herself like a man. But then all of a sudden, she throws all pretense off and she reveals herself to be a woman. Well, then she dies, and Tutmosis III is elevated to the throne. He then begins to launch military campaign after military campaign into the Sinai Peninsula and even as far as Canaan, as if he is looking for something or someone. I believe firmly that Tutmosis III was looking for Moses. He was looking for him. He was looking to try to kill him. So we know by this point that Moses has fled Egypt. The Exodus account tells us that he flees Egypt in part because he has struck down an Egyptian taskmaster. And he knows that Pharaoh is going to kill him. So he goes into the Sinai Peninsula and is a shepherd for 40 years until the Pharaoh of the oppression dies. If it's Tutmosis III, he reigns for a total of 54 years, including the 22 years he was co-reigning with his stepmother, Hatshepsut. So he dies. Amenhotep II is elevated to the throne. That is Tutmosis III's son. Amenhotep II has never met Moses. And so when Moses comes back to Egypt, one would expect if it was Ramses the Great and he knew Moses, had grown up with Moses, why didn't Ramses kill him on the spot? Because this Pharaoh, Amenhotep II, did not know Moses, was not familiar with him, was not familiar with all the drama and all the ins and outs of family politics. And so that helps to explain, at least it does to me, some of what is not said by Moses as much as what is said in the book of Exodus and also what is said here in Hebrews. So, by the way, Amenhotep II was called the Napoleon of Egypt because of all the military campaigns he launched into the Sinai Peninsula into Canaan. But as it stands, Moses was educated, as Stephen puts it, in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. If you examine the education that Egyptian royalty received, it was all-encompassing. They were trained to be political leaders. They were trained to be military leaders. They were trained to be diplomats. They were trained in every aspect of world leadership. Moses was the only person qualified to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. No other person fit the bill. God knew what he was doing. He always does. God knew what he was doing when he chose Moses, in short. So Moses is approached, this is not talked about in Hebrews text, but you remember Moses is approached by God from the burning bush. And Moses gives excuse after excuse after excuse. And God has an answer for every one of those excuses. One of the excuses that Moses makes is that I'm slow of speech. I can't speak, in other words. Well, maybe. We know that Aaron was given as his spokesman, and Aaron did do that for a while, but after a little while, Moses begins to speak for himself and pushes Aaron off to the side and takes over. Because Moses had been trained to do public speeches if he was going to be a leader. It's just like riding a bicycle. If you've been out of practice for a while, you're nervous getting on, but once you start, it comes back to you. Same thing with Moses. He had been trained to be a military leader, a political leader for 40 years, the first 40 years of his life. Second 40 years of his life, he is trained to be a shepherd. And now when he comes back to Egypt at age 80, he is ready. He doesn't think he is at first, but it's immediately apparent that he's ready to do what God told him to do. So Moses was eminently qualified, and that is elaborated here in our text in Hebrews 11 by the Hebrews writer. He gets into the character of Moses. This is what was going through his mind. He made a choice. When he was come to years, he made a choice. He refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. When he was faced with the oppression of his people, and when he saw what the Egyptian taskmasters were doing to the Israelites, when he saw the full impact of that, he had a choice to make. Moses could have chosen to ignore what was happening to the Israelites and chosen to have his name emblazoned on all of the walls of the statues and the monuments that would be erected to him, to have perhaps even a sphinx erected in his honor. He could have been one of the greatest pharaohs that the world had ever seen. But he chose not to do it. Moses had the it factor. To put it in modern terms, his parents, you are exactly right, his parents saw something in Moses early on. There are some babies that you call Gerber babies. They just look like they belong on a Gerber advertising thing. You know, they're just so beautiful. Of course, every baby is beautiful, right? Well, there's some babies that just have that it factor. And his parents saw that. And the more that Moses grew, the more he gained that kind of stature. I perceive Moses in my mind's eye to be more of a Hollywood leading man. You know, a Charlton Heston type. He's one of these guys that when he walks into a room, you just know. This guy is destined for great things. Moses was just exactly like that. What you're talking about really hits on it. He had that it factor from the very early stage. God knew it. God chose him for that role. And Moses filled it admirably. He makes this choice, refusing to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose, verse 25, to suffer affliction, to suffer persecution, is what the text says, with the people of God. Notice this, than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. Sin has pleasure associated with it. Otherwise, there would be no temptation. That's the reason why so many people fall into sin, is because there is pleasure associated with it for a certain period of time. But then when the glow wears off and the pleasure fades, what are you left with? Well, Moses realized this. Verse 26, esteeming the reproach of Christ. Now, he didn't know anything about the second person of the Godhead who would come later. The Hebrews writer is making an inspired commentary on this. He knew he was going to be reproached. The Hebrews writer compares it with the reproach of Christ, what Christ suffered. Greater riches. He would suffer as Christ suffered, in other words, to an extent. Greater riches than the treasures in Egypt. All the gold, all the jewelry, all the silver, all the splendor of Egypt could not match what he would ultimately receive. For he had respect, the King James says. He looked, the King James, the Greek text states, he looked unto the recompense of the reward. He looked beyond this life. He saw the ultimate prize, the ultimate goal. By faith, verse 27, he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. Now, there is a seeming contradiction here, because in the Exodus text, it indicates the reason why he fled Egypt was because he heard that the Pharaoh was going to kill him. That would seem to indicate being fearful, but there's not really a contradiction here. What he was not fearing was concerning his choice that he made. In other words, he was not afraid of the choice that he had made, the wrath of the king on his people, not on him personally. He knew that he should escape to be able to not be put to death, obviously. But he did not fear the wrath of the king. To accomplish God's purposes, he had to get out of Egypt, in other words. He endured as seeing him who is invisible. So, God appears to him in the intervening years, between verses 27 and 28, what Exodus tells us. He sees God, or sees the manifestation of God in the burning bush, which Jesus gives inspired commentary on that in Matthew 22. When he's responding to the Sadducees, he said, have you not read what Moses or what God said to you? And he refers to Exodus chapter 3, the burning bush narrative, when he said, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So there's a few things about what Jesus says there is interesting. He says, first, God said it. In other words, that scripture in Exodus 3 is inspired. Secondly, he said that God said it to you, the Sadducees. Now, in Exodus 3, who was talking? God. Who is he speaking to? Moses. But yet Jesus says he's speaking to you, Sadducees. And the third thing is, what was God talking about to Moses in Exodus 3? Was he talking about the resurrection from the dead? No. He was saying, what name should I, or Moses had said, who should I say has sent me? And God replies, I am that I am. I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So Jesus correctly infers what God clearly implies. I am, not I was, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. That means that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are still in existence somewhere, which means, by the way, the resurrection is actually true. So, Jesus uses that passage from Exodus 3 to make a point seemingly unrelated to Exodus 3. But it is, because of implication. Here, we see that he kept the Passover. This is what happens between verses 27 and 28. Verse 28, through faith, he kept the Passover. That is, when he comes back to Egypt and leads the Israelites out of Egyptian captivity. You remember, they spread the blood of the lamb on the doorpost and on the lintel, and they passed over them because they had that blood sprinkled on the doors. The sprinkling of blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith, verse 29, they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, which the Egyptians, essaying to do, were drowned. You recall what happened. Pharaoh finally relented and allowed the Israelites to leave Egypt. Go, take everything you have, after the firstborn of Egypt were all killed. Go, leave, take what you want. So the Israelites set out to go to the promised land, and they take the spoils of Egypt with them. And by the way, they also take Egyptian idols with them, by the way. But they leave Egypt. And then Pharaoh once again changes his mind. Amenhotep II decides, well, I'm going to pursue them anyway. So he does, but what is leading, or what is with the Israelites? The pillar of fire by night, the pillar of cloud by day. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10 that rock was Christ. They drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. The second person of the Godhead, the pre-existent Christ, was with the Israelites all the way from Egypt to the Promised Land. So, they're there at the Red Sea, and what are the Israelites doing? They're murmuring. Bless their hearts. They always murmur, don't they? Well, Moses tells them, stand still and see the deliverance of the Lord. God says to move forward. So Moses stretches forth his rod according to God's command, and the strong east wind blows all night and parts the Red Sea, and the water becomes as walls on the right hand and on the left, and they pass over dry ground. And according to what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10, they were baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. Which means, if I'm reading that correctly, that you have the walls of the Red Sea, the waters of the Red Sea on either side, and the cloud above, a canopy. Or maybe even they're present with them as they're passing through. They are baptized unto Moses. That's a figure, a type of our baptism. They pass over dry ground to the other side, and then, of course, Moses stretches forth his rod, and the waters close and destroys all of the Egyptian armies that are pursuing. So, when it comes to the Red Sea and biblical scholarship, you'll see a lot of different opinions bandied about. Well, they really didn't cross over the Red Sea. Well, it wasn't really water as walls on the right hand and on the left. Denying what Moses clearly states, number one. Denying what the Hebrews writer clearly states here in Hebrews 11. Otherwise, you've got a situation where both Moses and the Hebrews writer, and I would add Jesus, are all saying, well, you know, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, you know, Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, wink, wink. There's nothing like that. There's no hint that the inspired writers are saying, well, we know that really didn't happen. None of that. Jesus, in fact, says, if you had believed Moses, you would have believed me, for he wrote of me. But if you don't believe his writings, how will you believe my words? That is as clear as language could possibly be. And yet, we have a professor in one of our universities out in Texas Not around here. We have a professor out in one of our universities that has written in a massive one-volume commentary of the Bible, which I have in my library, just for reference purposes. But still, this guy that I'm referring to, I was in school with an undergraduate work. He went on to Harvard. Now, there's nothing wrong with going to Harvard if you're solid and grounded. This guy wasn't, because he says that Moses did not write the first 5 books of the Bible. He's a member of the church. He is in a major Bible department out in Texas. And yet he says that Moses didn't write the first 5 books of the Bible. Well, I think I'll believe the Lord's account over a scholar. Now, there's nothing wrong with scholarship, as long as scholarship doesn't deny the biblical truth, what we know to be true. But when scholarship denies biblical truth, I'll go with the Bible every single time. I can tell you, having gone through biblical scholarship in postgraduate work, there's a lot of wacko ideas out there. And I just put it that way, it's wacko. Some of this stuff that you'll read and you're saying, what is this? And yet you wade through it because you've got to be familiar with it and you've got to be able to answer it. One of those wacko ideas is that Moses had nothing to do with the first 5 books of the Bible. That Israel somehow came up with the Israelite religion. Israel came up with monotheism. Israel, over a period of hundreds of years, developed gradually this idea of what we read in the Old Testament. No. Moses wrote it. He's the only one qualified to write it. He had enough time to write it. He had 40 years in the wilderness to write all 5 books. Now, I've written 3 books. I don't see myself writing another one for a good while. It takes a lot out of you. I don't understand how some of these guys that write a book a year or a book every 6 months, I don't see how they've got the energy to do it. But yet Moses wrote 5 books in 40 years. Plenty of time. Well, that was through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. What I'm saying is Moses was the only man qualified to do it. He was the only person that could have led Israel out of Egyptian captivity. He is the only person that could have led them to the Promised Land. He was the preeminently qualified person to do all of that. Verse 30, by faith. Now he jumps from Moses to post-Moses, after Moses' death. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they were compassed about 7 days. Here's another biblical account that's denied by the scholars. Liberal scholars, I should say. Oh, this didn't really happen like it did. Well, I got news for you. It did. And there's evidence to indicate that it did, even though that evidence is denied by liberals. Well, the time frame doesn't fit. The timeline doesn't fit. But yet, there at the archaeological sites in Jericho, there is a section of the retaining wall that is collapsed, by the way, that forms a perfect ramp over which an army or a group of people could march right into the city. Is that how the walls of Jericho fell? Yes. And yet we're to believe, according to liberal scholars, no, it didn't. Well, I'll believe the biblical account once again over liberal scholarship. And it was by faith that this happened. Why? Because of obedience. Moses obeyed God. He led the Israelites out of Egyptian captivity. The Israelites, post-Moses, under Joshua's leadership, obeyed God. They, of course, passed over the Jordan River after it was parted, similar to what the Red Sea had happened to it. They came into Canaan, and they took Jericho according to the command of God. And that's a fascinating story in and of itself there in Joshua chapter 6, verse 31. By faith the harlot Rahab perished not with them that believed not or who were disobedient when she had received the spies with peace. Now Rahab is described as a harlot, both in Joshua's account and in the book of Hebrews. This is describing what she was before she came to faith in God. She came to a faith in the one true God because, I believe I'm citing this correctly, she told the spies, we had heard of the terror of the Lord. In other words, their fame had already spread to the Canaanites. They had already known about what had happened. And that persuaded her. These things that took place, she understood, was not something that some man dreamed up. It wasn't something that was concocted. It was God's doing. And she changed. She changed her life. And by faith, she hid the spies. She and where she was in Jericho was spared. The rest of the city was destroyed, but her area where she lived was spared from being destroyed. And so, verse 32, what shall I more say? He said, there's a lot more I can say. For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, and of Barak, and of Samson, and of Jephthah, of David also, and Samuel, and of the prophets. All of these individuals have so much affiliated with them. Gideon, the great judge. Great story there in the book of Judges. And by faith, he obeyed the Lord. And then Barak, another judge of Israel. A tremendous story. Samson, of course. We all know the story of Samson. His strength was in his hair, and out of a moment of weakness, he revealed that source of strength to Delilah. His hair was cut. He was overwhelmed by the Philistines and carried off into their captivity after he had already won many battles over many of the Canaanite tribes because his strength was given to him by God. But then after they put his eyes out and put him as laboring in the prison, his hair begins to grow back. He prays to God, and God grants him the strength one more time to inflict massive damage upon them. And he sets himself, or has the servant with him set him against the pillars of the building, and he literally brings the house down and kills more people in his death than he had in his life. He came back to a faith in God right before he died. He did not commit suicide, by the way. He was bringing out the judgment of God against an ungodly people. So he is mentioned here in the Hall of Fame of faith. And then he says Jephthah. Jephthah won a great battle for the Israelites, and yet Jephthah made a rash, foolish vow. That was a big mistake that he made. And that's a story in and of itself that we can get into as to what was the consequences of that vow. We won't get into it, though. Jephthah, though, was one who did win a great battle for the Lord and is mentioned here by name. And then David is mentioned. King David, the man after God's own heart, the man who was a great king, and yet he had a weakness. We know what happened between him and Bathsheba. He tried to cover up what he had done, tried to hide it, and yet Nathan the prophet comes to him, and in that great confrontation, one of those DVD moments. I always say there are DVD moments in the Bible. I wish I could see it. This is one of those DVD moments. Nathan, in essence, points his finger at David and says, "Thou art the man. You are the man." To David's credit, he did not get in front of all the people of Israel, wag his finger and said, "I did not have relations with that woman Bathsheba." He didn't do that, or anything akin to it. He poured out his heart in confession before the Lord. Psalm 51, one of the greatest confessions that you can ever read about. And that child dies. But later David and Bathsheba have other children. You know of Solomon, Solomon, who is mentioned here, but they have another son whom they name Nathan. There's no grudge held by David and Bathsheba against Nathan the prophet. David was a great man of faith. And then verse 33, he really in a summary fashion talks about Samuel. Well, you mentioned Samuel because he is the first of the prophets that we read about. Moses is, of course, the first prophet of God. But Samuel is the first in the line of the non-literary and the literary prophets. Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions. Who do you think of when you think about stopping the mouths of the lions? Daniel. One of my favorite characters because of Daniel's great faith from the time he was about 18 years old when he's carried away into captivity under King Nebuchadnezzar. He begins serving in the Babylonian court. He and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, I like them by their Hebrew names, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. But Daniel is a man of faith. From the time he's 18 years old up until the time he's well into his 90s, he never gives up on God. He never turns his back on God, in spite of all the opposition that is thrown his way. This incident is mentioned particularly by the Hebrews writer. This happened when he was in his 70s. Think about it. Daniel is now a man in his 70s. He is serving in the Persian court under the king. And his enemies, Daniel's enemies, find out about what he's doing, praying to God at certain times during the day with his face and his door and windows open toward Jerusalem. They're plotting against him, and they persuade the king to make a law, the law of the Medes and Persians alters not, of course, that anyone caught praying to another god other than the one here in Persia should be thrown into the lion's den. And so they know that if they came a certain time to Daniel's place of residence, they would see him praying. Well, they have him thrown into the lion's den. And the king loved Daniel. He didn't want that to happen to him, but he could not change the law. There's no way for him to change the law. And he worries about it all night. He's up all night worrying about it. Early in the morning, he comes to the lion's den and calls out to Daniel, "Are you safe? Are you okay?" The way we would say it. And Daniel calls back, "I'm here." And he looks in the lion's den, and there he is among the lions, and those mouths are stopped. They don't touch him. Daniel is taken out of that lion's den, and the enemies of Daniel are thrown into that lion's den, and they are torn to pieces. Torn to pieces. Daniel's great faith was the reason why that happened. So, they stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, said, "We will not bow to that image." Remember, Nebuchadnezzar had seen that great image that Daniel interpreted in Daniel chapter 2. So what does Nebuchadnezzar do right after that? He builds a great image for everybody to bow down to. At the sound of the dulcimer and the harp and the pipe, you are to bow down and worship. Well, these three boys, and they are boys, there can't be more than about 21, 22 years of age by this point, they say, "We will not bow. No matter what happens, we will not bow." That kind of attitude needs to be had today by so many. Whatever happens, we will not bow. Whatever happens in November, whoever's elected, we will not bow. Whatever happens in the United States, we will not bow. That is, we will not bow to cultural pressure. We will not bow to political pressure. We will not bow to any kind of pressure to compromise our faith and to give up what we know to be true. We need that attitude, we need that courage, and we need that conviction. Just like those three young boys had. We will not bow. And so they are thrown into the fiery furnace. You remember the men that brought those boys up the fiery furnace were killed immediately. It was that hot. Well, what happens? They look inside that fiery furnace, and if you know the configuration, likely the fiery furnace, you know how that thing operated. You could actually see directly into it and not be affected by it coming from this way. And so they look into it and they see the three boys and one other person in there, like unto a son of God. Could that be the pre-existent Christ? Maybe. Could that be the angel of the Lord? Quite possibly. There's a big discussion as to who that was in there with them. But at any rate, God's presence is with those boys, and they are not touched. Not a hair on their head is singed. Their clothes don't even smell like the fire because of their faith. And notice, continuing, escaped the edge of the sword. Out of weakness were made strong. Waxed valiant in fight. Turned to flight the armies of the aliens. That describes so many of the great heroes of the Old Testament. How they defeated their enemies in battle. And how that they overcame incredible odds. Women received their dead raised to life again. Two incidents in the Old Testament come to mind with this. The widow of Zarephath and the Shunammite woman. They had their dead raised to life. And others were tortured, but not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. That word tortured is a very interesting word. The late Brother Neil Lightfoot, in his commentary on Hebrews, makes a comment about that very word that's used there in verse 35. Let me read to you exactly what he says, and I think he's on to something with this. Let me find it here. He says, they were tortured, refusing to accept release that they might rise again to a better life. He says, the Greek verb means to stretch out on the drum, which was some sort of instrument of torture. Apparently, the victim was stretched on a frame, perhaps like a wheel, and beaten to death with sticks and rods. That's what that word carries with it in the Greek. A punishment of this kind is recorded in 2 Maccabees 6:18-31. That is an apocryphal book that is in between the Old and New Testament. It's valuable for historical records, but it's not inspired. According to this, during the persecutions of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, Eleazar the scribe at the age of 90 preferred to be tortured on the rack, which is the same word used here by the Hebrews writer, rather than eat pork. Another instance of severe torture of a mother and her 7 sons is found in another passage in 2 Maccabees. In other words, the Hebrews writer, possibly by implication, is referring to what happened to faithful men and women in later years during the period in between the Old and New Testament, because they refused to submit to the Greek way of life, and rather they chose to be faithful to the Lord's will. And by the way, the period of the Maccabean revolt is a fascinating period in and of itself. I just finished last night an online class for Faulkner, Introduction to Critical Studies, where it's a semester course. And last night we concluded the intertestamental period. And when you read and study the intertestamental period, it's fascinating because of the forces outside Israel that came in to try to conquer Israel, and the revolt by the Israelites against Greek rule. Judas Maccabeus, who is known as the Hammer, was the first one that led a successful revolt against Gentile rule and reestablished, as it were, Jewish control over Palestine. Very fascinating story in and of itself, but this could very well possibly be referring to some of that. At the very least, it refers to Old Testament worthies that were not told about in the text, who were tortured in those ways. So, verse 36, and others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover, of bonds and imprisonment. They were thrown in prison. They were scourged. They were bound. Verse 37, they were stoned. We know that Zechariah was stoned. The text tells us that in 2 Kings. And it's possible that Jeremiah was stoned, even though the text doesn't tell us that. Tradition says that he was. They were sawn asunder. Literally, they were sawed in half, or had their limbs sawed off. We're not told in the biblical text who it was that was sawn asunder. Tradition says Isaiah was, that he was placed into a log, a hollow log, bound from head to foot, and was sawn asunder. Quite possible. They were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins. The slain with the sword refers to the prophets by Ahab. Ahab killed the prophets by the sword. Uriah was killed by the sword by King Jehoiakim. Maybe possibly others. They were wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins. That refers to Elijah. Being destitute, afflicted, tormented, or ill-treated. That again refers to Elijah. Of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. Referring again to the prophets. Think about all that they went through. Think about all the torture, the abuse, the imprisonment. Well, unfortunately, that's the cue to stop. So what we're going to do is we're going to stop right here before he makes his main point in verses 39 and 40, and we will pick up with that and go through chapter 12, hopefully.